Okay, so reinforcement learning, and why this is such a appealing sort of topic is because you can relate to it very well. This is how we normally learn. Okay, and it's kind of like the 5-year-old looks at a hot cup of coffee and says, "Should I touch it or not?" Tries to touch it, and it gets burned. Okay, and so the next time looks at a hot cup of coffee with steam coming up, realizes I shouldn't touch it, I got burned. But still, there's a pain there. So whatever action you take, you experience a pain of an unsatisfied curiosity. Okay, so. Rather than that complicated problem, let's take a much simpler problem, okay, to illustrate all the basic concepts of reinforcement learning. So, there's a restaurant, there are 2 restaurants, there's restaurant A and restaurant B. Okay, so restaurant A and restaurant B. So these are restaurants. Okay. So now let's assume that the only thing you can see is there are these 2 restaurants with black curtains. You can't sort of look in and see who's there, how are the crowds, and so on and so forth. And we pretend that we're in the day where you don't have TripAdvisor and Yelp and so on, so you can't just go and look at reviews. So the question is, where are you going to eat? Okay, which restaurant are you going to pick? Well, at the beginning you know nothing. Okay? So you try one of the restaurants. So you tried restaurant A. You tried restaurant A. Okay, and you had a decent meal. Let's say you were satisfied. So satisfied. Let's call that outcome 1. Satisfied. 1. Okay. Now the next week you come. Okay, so let's say in your little city there are only 2 restaurants. So the next week you come. So week 1. Now the next week you come. Week 2. Now which restaurant do you try? Okay. Now there are 2 competing kinds of personalities here when we talk about humans. The first competing personality, the first kind of personality is, I'm low risk. Listen, I tried this, I got a decent meal, okay, so I'm going to stick with it. And then there's the other personality, which is the wild exploration kind of personality where, you know what, I've already tried that, so, I don't want to go to the same place, okay, I'm going to try B. Okay. Now, there are pros and cons of both. So you try A, it's safe. You sort of already had one decent meal, so you're pretty satisfied. You're kind of expecting to be satisfied for the next meal. But perhaps restaurant B is going to serve you the dish that you have never eaten in your life that's so fantastic that, wow, why haven't I eaten here before, would have been your reaction. Okay, so that's the downside of sticking to the safe choice A. Okay, and there's also a downside of not sticking to A. You go for B and it's a total disaster. It's a complete horrible nightmare. Okay, and then you're thinking to yourself, wow, I should have stayed safe and gone with A. Okay, so these are the sort of thoughts that are probably going through your mind when you're trying to decide restaurant A or restaurant B for the second time. Okay. Now, it turns out that this kind of a problem is a very common problem faced. Okay, and we can create an abstract version of it. So that's what I'm going to show you, the abstract version of it. This is an example of what is called a bandit problem. So bandit problems. Okay. And in bandit problems, they sort of capture, in some sense, most of the essential details of reinforcement learning. There's one aspect of it that it doesn't capture, which is that your environment might be changing depending on how you act. But okay, that gets to a slightly more sophisticated, setting. But that's okay. That's a sophisticated setting we can also handle. So let's consider the bandit setting. Okay, so we say that restaurant A is a bandit. Okay, and it gives you a reward. How satisfied were you when you ate there? And let's simplify. Okay, let's say that the reward is either 0 or 1. And the probability of getting a reward 1 is P1, okay, for bandit 1. Okay, and you can think of this as a one-armed bandit, just like the slots in Vegas. So you pull the bandit, and it either rewards you with a 1, or you get or it flops you with a 0. Okay, and there's a probability P1 over 1. Okay. And there's a second bandit with a probability P2 over 1. Okay. And this guy can also reward you with a 0 or a 1. More generally, we might say there's a distribution over the rewards. Okay? And this distribution is very simple. It's a Bernoulli reward, probability P1, Bernoulli reward, probability P2. Okay, nice. Okay. And here's what you do. You come the first time you tried restaurant A, so that means you pulled bandit 1 and you got a reward. So you got a reward of 1. Okay. And now your second pull, the question we're asking is, do you want to pull Bandit 1, the safe choice, okay? Or do you want to pull Bandit 2, the risky choice? Now, why is this? This is the maximum reward you could have gotten. So why do we say this is the risky choice and this is the safe choice? Well, this is not necessarily the safe choice. This one could have been by accident. The next time you pull, you might get a 0. Okay. So imagine, for example, that P1 is equal to, let's say P1 is equal to P1 equals 0.7 and P2 equals 0.9. So then, you just got lucky. You got a 1. And if you keep the safe choice going, 70% of the time you'll get a 1 and your average reward will be 0.7, when you could have been living in this other world, pulling Bandit 2 and getting an average reward of 0.9. Disaster. Could be the other way around. P1 could equal 0.9 and P2 could equal 0.7. Okay? And in trying to figure out whether the world you live in is the one where P2 is good, you try P2 and it gives you a disaster reward. Okay? And it could be even the case that you're in the first world where P2 is bigger, and when you try the second bandit, it by chance gives you a 0. Okay? And so it becomes a highly non-trivial question. What's a good strategy for figuring out what bandit to play at every time step? What's a good strategy for figuring out what restaurant to eat at, depending on what historical rewards you have got? Okay, so this is an example of a simple scenario of figuring out which restaurant to eat, but we can abstract from it all the essential ingredients of reinforcement learning. So here, reinforcement learning. Okay, so the first thing, there's no supervisor. Okay, there's no supervisor. And what do we mean by that? So unlike in the supervised setting where, your data in your data, you are told, what's the best action or what's the correct action. In the reinforcement setting, there's no supervisor telling you, you know what? Bandit 1 is the best action. Because if there was a supervisor, there's nothing to learn. I'm telling you exactly what your environment is and then you just act optimally depending on P1 and P2. Okay, so there's no supervisor. Okay, so what that means is that you just try things. You try things. And you get rewards, or in some sense penalties. Sometimes it can be penalties, sometimes it can be rewards. In general, we call that reinforcement. Okay. In general, we call that reinforcement. Okay. So this alone doesn't make the problem much more challenging than the supervised setting, because, why don't I just try things? Okay, why don't I just try things? Okay, and try all possible actions and then see which actions result in the largest reward, and then take that action as my final action. Okay, and so the point in the reinforcement learning setting is, as you try things, the rewards are real rewards. You feel real pain and real or real reward. Okay, so the rewards are real. The rewards are real in the sense that in trying things, you're actually acting and you actually experience the reward. Okay, so what we say is that your actions are online. You have to take your actions as the time comes. You don't get to sort of sit back and see what's going on, and then after some time decide what bandit I'm going to play. In order to get information to decide what bandit to play, or in order to get information on the restaurants, you have to actually try, and then you experience the pain or reward, and then from that you learn, and that helps your decisions later. So that's what we call an online decision-making setting. So the rewards are real and occur in real time. So this is online decision making. Okay, so there's an online flavor to the rewards. And what that brings along with it is the notion of time. Okay, so there's a notion of time, and you start at the beginning, and then time moves forward, and at every time step you make an action and you experience a reward, and you can't go back. You can't revisit that same, scenario and change your action. Okay, so there's a notion of time. And so actions are, in some sense, permanent. So you make the action, and then time moves forward, and you get the reward, and you experience the reward or the pain. Okay? So the actions are permanent. You don't get now back. You don't get to go back. And so all of this together, would also be still not a very hard problem until I give you the last important property that the reinforcement learning scenario brings in, which is that you are interested in your rewards coming to you sooner rather than later. Okay, so recent reward is better than later reward. Okay, and this sort of reminds me of the story of the old man. So the story of the old man goes like this. The guy is born and becomes of age and 13, 14 and watches everybody doing stuff and this and that and doesn't do anything. Okay, he's just carefully watching, and time is going by. Carefully watching, and time is going by. Okay, and assimilating all this information. And then finally when the dude is 85 years old, he has figured out, because he has watched everything, he has seen everything, he has figured out what the right thing to do is. So now he's 85 and he goes for it. Now he knows what to do. Okay, and makes his millions of dollars. And he's now 90 and finally he has made his millions of dollars, and then at 91 the old man dies. Okay. And so this is just a story that sort of explains in sort of human terms why earlier reward is better than later reward, because you can spend earlier reward. Okay, you can enjoy earlier reward. Okay. And we have ways of quantifying this, but the intuition is that earlier reward is better than later reward. Okay. So this poses a real challenge. Okay. Now, in order to make reinforcement learning somewhat tractable, we have to make some assumptions. Okay, so how much more important is it? If the only thing that matters is tomorrow's reward, okay, or my current decision on whether or not to eat at the restaurant, then there's nothing you can do. You just randomly choose a restaurant, and what you get is what you get. Okay? So recent reward is better than later reward, but you do care about later reward. Okay, so you do care about later reward. Okay? So we have to make some kinds of assumptions. Otherwise, it's just a random guess which restaurant to eat at. Okay? And then there's one more kind of thing that we need to assume in this reinforcement learning setting, is that, since the only way to get information is to try things, and then we want to ideally try the good things early because recent reward is better than later reward. But still, we'd like to live and try good things with time because we do also value later rewards. So even if my earlier rewards are not that good, I would still like my later rewards to be, in some sense, optimal because I do care about later reward. Okay? But how do I even get to the later reward stage? Is that, it must be the case that this reinforcement learning game will go on for some time. Okay? And this reminds me of the situation of the baby learning to walk next to the cliff. Don't let your children learn to walk next to the cliff because they're reinforcement learners. So they're trying to learn how to walk, they fall down. They try to learn how to walk, they fall down. And now they're next to the cliff. They try to learn how to walk and they fall down and boom, they've fallen off the cliff. You can't do reinforcement learning in such adverse scenarios where the learning can be cut short abruptly, or equivalently, the rewards can get so bad during the learning phase that it sort of outweighs anything that can happen in the future. Okay? So providing that you're in a reasonably well-behaved reinforcement learning situation, it turns out that there's a lot we can do. One thing that's missing from here is we're sort of assuming that you're learning in a static environment, so these bandits are not changing. But you might have a suspicion that the bandits might be changing. For example, as you win more and more in Vegas, maybe they're changing the probabilities of, the bandits producing reward. Okay, so, and we can take into account that additional complexity. But for the moment, these are the fundamental sort of defining characteristics of a reinforcement learning setting. Okay? No supervisor, you try things and get rewards. The rewards are real. So you want rewards. You will feel the pain of rewards, and those actions that generated those rewards are permanent. You can't revisit them because there's a notion of time. Okay, and you prefer recent reward to later reward, but at the same time, you do care about, at the end of the day, acting optimally because the game will go on for some time.